train. Lord, I said the train is coming, baby. I said the train is coming now. I said the train is coming, baby. I said the train is coming now. Every day I pray for this little hour. Now the time has come, and I want you to stand by me, because the train is coming, baby, and we are leaving on the train, and we will roam this land where we all will.
Bonjour, ici Alan Rock, recteur de l'Université d'Ottawa, l'Université canadienne. Hello, this is Alan Rock, President of the University of Ottawa, Canada's university. Composez le numéro du poste que vous voulez joindre maintenant ou demeurer en ligne. Enter the extension number you wish to reach now or stay on the line.
Hey, it's time for the 5 o'clock train. You know it when you hear President Alan Rock ask how to direct your call. It means you're to sit down and listen to 1 hour of interview with some mover in society. And today we have Dr. Bob Carter, who is, well, first of all, I want to make sure there's a connection there. Are you there, Bob?
Yes, good morning. I know it's afternoon, isn't it for you, Dennis?
It's afternoon for me, but it's what is it, 8 a.m. in Australia there now?
It's a lovely morning. I've walked the dog, I've had breakfast, and I'm relaxed and ready for all you can throw at me.
Oh, that's great. And so you're in Queensland. And
Queensland, on the Great Barrier Reef, over 1,000 kilometres north of Brisbane, which is the state capital, but I'm up here in the tropics.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to say that you're a very special guest for us today because we're going to talk about climate change, global warming, and you are quite a highly recognized expert. You're an accomplished academic researcher. You're presently an adjunct research fellow at the James Cook University in Queensland. You're a paleontologist, a stratigrapher, a marine geologist, an environmental scientist. You've got 40 years of professional experience. You have degrees from Otago University in New Zealand and also Cambridge from the UK. And so you have been one of these, what some people would call one of the deniers. How would you respond to that?
That's true, and those are very kind opening remarks, Dennis. Thank you. I am indeed a senior professional geologist. The word denier is an interesting one because, as you would be aware, to introduce it into the public debate is deliberately to introduce emotionalism. And as a scientist, you and I do everything we can to remove any possible emotionalism from our work and our arguments. So you'll very rarely find a scientist of stature using the word denialist. And denialist was replaced an earlier, slightly kinder critical adjective or noun, skeptic. Now, of course, I'm a skeptic. I'm a scientist. All scientists are trained to be skeptics. But when it's used against people in the global warming context, it means that you're skeptical of the science of global warming. Now, again, I'm a scientist, so I'm not actually skeptical of the science of global warming. I'm agnostic about it, and there's a big difference between being agnostic and being skeptical. I have no axe to grind, and I'm sure you don't either. My only interest is in looking at the facts, let the facts fall where they may, and we'll then draw some conclusions from those facts. So words like denier and skeptic are not very useful in the scientific debate. They're just an attempt to introduce emotional judgments about people.
Okay. Now, Bob, you said you were agnostic. What is it that you're not certain about yet? What is it that you're agnostic about? Which aspects of this broad issue are you not certain about?
Let's back up to an even broader issue, science itself. I'm agnostic about everything because that's the appropriate scientific stance. We don't understand anything in detail at some certain level. So any scientist spends their whole life looking at problems or issues and starting off with no presumptions, or you try to do that. Of course, it's very difficult to do. And in terms of the global warming issue, the idea that the public is being told about or the propaganda they're being told, is that human carbon dioxide emissions will cause not global warming, but dangerous global warming. So that's the idea that needs to be tested. And, scientists call such an idea a hypothesis. And we then need to assemble facts, and I'm happy to do that for you in a moment, to test that hypothesis. But you never hear it put that way in the public debate. The newspaper reporter that interviews me, or the radio reporter, always starts off with a question like, Bob, do you believe in climate change? Now, of course, first, I'm a scientist, belief's got nothing to do with it. But secondly, it's not about climate change. It's not even about global warming. It's about dangerous global warming caused by human carbon dioxide emissions. That is a very specific and testable scientific hypothesis. And when you test it, it fails.
Now, when you say it fails, do you mean that you can't decide either way? It may be dangerous or it may not be dangerous? What do you mean it fails?
Well, it fails in the scientific sense. You can't prove or disprove anything, as you know. You can only show on the balance of probabilities that the evidence either supports a proposition or it doesn't support it. There is no empirical evidence, factual evidence, that supports the idea that dangerous global warming is being caused by human carbon dioxide emissions. Now note, that's not saying that carbon dioxide does not cause, extra carbon dioxide does not cause some warming. Of course it does. It's a greenhouse gas, we all understand that, and therefore if extra goes into the atmosphere, in principle, extra warming will be caused. But that's not what the discussion is about. The discussion is about how much extra warming, and specifically how much extra warming by the human component of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
Yes. Now, I'd like to back up myself just a little bit from something you just said. Now, I'll agree with you that from the pure radiation physics standpoint, if you add CO2 into the atmosphere and change nothing else, you must get warming from the greenhouse effect. The problem is it's a planet. It's a highly complex thing with all kinds of feedbacks, and when you change one thing, there's all kinds of responses. Are you saying that if you increase the amount of CO2 that it's been determined that there is some warming?
No, I actually used the words in principle there will be warming, or in theory, for the very good reason you've just said the radiation physics, the equations of radiation physics tell you that. But the point you are making or implying is that it's not that simple, because there are many feedback effects or loops.
Yes.
And so as you increase the amount of carbon dioxide, other things are not equal. Other things change. And as I'm sure you know, the United Nations body, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that advises governments on this issue, has advised governments on the basis of computer models that they have. And those computer models try to describe the climate system, and in some ways they do rather well, and in other ways they don't do well at all. And because they don't do well at all, they cannot actually predict future climate, but they're still useful experiments to undertake, to run a computer model to see where we would be if the following assumptions are made.
Yes,
so those computer models actually project that there will be a significant increase in warming, actually of about 3 degrees, if we double the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and some models up to 6 degrees, and that's a significant amount of warming. Coming back to your point, which is what does the basic radiation physics theory say, it says that if you double the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and this number is not controversial, the IPCC agrees with independent scientists and with radiation physicists, you will get, all other things being equal, about 1 degree of warming.
Yes.
Yet the IPCC says 3 to 6 degrees, so how the difference? The difference, of course, is that the IPCC puts into its models a positive feedback loop, which is perfectly rational and goes as follows. Little bit of warming, little bit of extra carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, produces that warming, and that produces a little bit more evaporation from the oceans. water vapor is actually a very powerful and indeed the most important greenhouse gas on the planet. So that extra water vapor will now give you a little bit of extra warming. In other words, a positive feedback loop. And all of that's fine. It's perfectly sensible, rational scientific thinking. But where it falls down is it just takes one feedback effect out of literally hundreds, many of which we do not fully know about, and says we'll look at that feedback effect but not the others. So that's how the IPCC gets these alarming amounts of warming, by looking only at a major positive feedback loop and ignoring all the others.
Well, Bob, for just for the benefits of our listeners, I want to point out that feedback mechanism that you just described can easily turn the other way, because if you have a little bit more water vapor, you may get more clouds. If you have more clouds, you'll have a higher albedo, so you'll reflect away more sunlight, and that effect can overpower the pure greenhouse gas effect of that water vapor.
Absolutely understood, and that's a negative feedback, and it's one that the IPCC doesn't consider. And one of the reasons, again, as you know, is that it's incredibly difficult mathematically to model what's going on inside clouds, because we don't fully understand it.
Yes, so, or where the clouds will form, at what altitude, what kinds of clouds they will be, how long they will last, and so on, right?
Of course, but the key issue we want to get across to the listeners is that other things are not equal. When you increase the amount of carbon dioxide, you set in train a whole bunch of feedback loops, some positive, some negative. Therefore, and you don't understand all of those or even know about them, so therefore you cannot just use a theoretical projection, which is what a computer model is, to give you an accurate answer about what's going to happen in the future. You just can't do that because you don't know enough about the system. So you have to come back to what I spoke of at the beginning, which is the empirical science, not the theoretical science.
Yes, and this is where you have great expertise, because you've looked at, for example, marine sediment cores and tried to look at the stratigraphy and deduce a time sequence of climate events on Earth, or at least such that these sediments would have been deposited in this sequence. You're an expert in doing that, aren't you?
It is an area that I have worked in, yes. It's called paleoclimatology, and the two major archives of data that are used are mud cores from beneath the deep seabed and ice cores through the Antarctic and Greenland ice cap and some elsewhere. And those cores have layers in them which have accumulated one by one on top of the other. And so if you drill a hole down through them and retrieve the core, then you have the layers in the core, and each successive layer gets older downwards. And so now you can analyze different things from the core that relate to the climate at the time that the particular layer was deposited. There are ways of dating the cores, albeit never quite accurate as you would like them to be, but there are ways of dating the cores, and you can assemble a climate history. Now, when you do that, there's a key point that is missing from the public discussion, and it's this. The public are constantly told that it is unusually warm, that temperatures at the end of the 20th century were not just unusually but dangerously warm, and the computer models say they're going to get warmer. That is literally scientific tosh. It is only believed by people who are part of the meteorological, climatological community that only look at historical instrument records. They only look at records of the last 100 to 300 years, because that's all we've had thermometers for. And of course that doesn't tell you anything about climate. That's basically a weather record. Climate is something that happens over thousands to tens of thousands to millions of years, and the records you've just referred to and I've talked about, the mud cores and the ice cores, are the archives of that ancient climate record. And when you look at that record, every which way up, this is not a matter of any single person's opinion, thousands of scientists have produced ancient climate records which demonstrate that there was nothing unusually warm about the temperature at the end of the 20th century, and it hasn't increased since then, so that means today. Now, that is an astonishing statement for me to make, knowing that many of your listeners will be, to say the least, surprised by that.
Yeah. Well, one of the...
Bite is taught to first-year geology students around the world and has been for 100 years. It's an absolute, fundamental fact that we know about the climate system. So how is it that in the public domain it is believed still that we have dangerous warming at the end of the 20th century?
Mm-hmm. Well, in other words, it would not have been dangerous that far back. For example, even human beings have been around for 1 million years, and they thrived in all kinds of climates where there would have been relative warming and cooling compared to present time.
In the last 1 million years, we have had temperature excursions at least. Now, I'll explain why this is difficult to say, and I can't say it globally because we do not have accurate global records prior to the invention of the thermometer. What we do have, however, from ice cores and from mud cores is accurate regional records, and we look at them from different places around the world. We can see a common pattern in them, but we can't actually measure a global temperature 1 million years ago, but we can do our best to reconstruct one. And when we do that, coming back to your question about humans, in the last 1 million years, we find the temperature has been as much as 5 degrees warmer than today during one of the interglacial periods of the great ice ages that we've just been going through. Mm-hmm. More typically, it's commonly been 2 degrees or even 3 degrees warmer than today. So, of course, what we didn't have was industrial civilization and infrastructure across the planet at those points. So when we say that ancient man or Australopithecines basically survived that, they were living probably in the tropics largely, and in the tropical regions, the temperature does not vary very much between a glaciation and an interglaciation. So they would not have seen a big signal, but technically you're quite right when you say that we've had periods of temperature up to several degrees warmer than today in the last 1 million years. And if you go back beyond 1 million years, warmer again than that.
Well, I want to concentrate on one very specific point related to the ice cores. There are a number of independent studies that have concluded that if you look at the ice core record in the last period, the one that connects to present time, the CO2 increases follow thereafter increases in temperature that can be seen in those ice cores. In other words, it appears that the temperature increase occurs before the increase in CO2.
That is correct. And before I explain that a little, Dennis, let me say that it is one of the miracles of modern science that scientists can take an ice core from Antarctica, say, and go down to a particular layer in the core, and then take a block of ice out, put it into a flask, a sealed flask, and melt it, and retrieve, and here in their hand, in the laboratory, inside the flask, is the atmosphere 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, and in Antarctica, samples back to almost 1 million years ago. That is truly one of the miracles of contemporary science, and then that they can analyze that ancient atmosphere and determine the amount of methane or carbon dioxide and other things in it.
Yes.
So it is the most beautifully sophisticated science, and I'm a geologist, and if you were to look at me, you can't because we're not doing a video, you'd see that my left shoulder is a little bit lower than my right shoulder, and that's because all geologists have a large chip on their shoulder. There's no Nobel Prize for geology, but if there were a Nobel Prize for geology, it would have been awarded for this work. It's just beautiful work.
Yeah, but in addition...
As you say, when you look at it, what you find is that the change in carbon dioxide follows the change in temperature by a period of between 400 or 500 years and up to 1,500 or 2,000 years. There's always a delay, but it's the it's the temperature that changes first and the carbon dioxide that follows.
So just to be clear, there have been all these cycles of decrease and increase and so on, and you can follow the temperature and the CO2, and every time it's a temperature that increases before the CO2 does. So it's as though the temperature, the increase in temperature, whatever's increasing the temperature, is also causing CO2 to be released.
Correct, and it's not just on the long scale in the ice cores over thousands and hundreds of thousands of years that that's true. There is also an annual cycle of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere relating to the northern hemisphere, large areas that are forested or under agriculture, and plants, as you know, feed on CO2. And during the spring and summer, as they go into their burst of annual growth, they suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at such a large rate that globally the amount of carbon dioxide goes down. And then we go into autumn and winter, the deciduous trees shed their leaves, most trees stop photosynthesizing mostly, and so the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere rises again. And of course, we know in going from winter to summer, the temperature also goes from warmer in summer to cooler in winter. And when you look at that cycle, the annual cycle, you find again that the change in temperature precedes the change in carbon dioxide. So it's on every time scale from the annual through to the geological. And it's like arguing that that lung cancer causes smoking, to argue that carbon dioxide drives changes in temperature.
Right.
The data are the other way around. It is the change in temperature that changes the carbon dioxide, which raises the question, how?
Right. But I want to come back to the ice cores for just a second, because some of our listeners that are very attentive will have noticed that you explained how we're able to sample the ancient atmosphere, but there isn't a small thermometer trapped in the ice there. But in fact, there is a small thermometer trapped in the ice, isn't there?
Yes, there is. That's very clever. There are various things you can analyze for, and one of the things you can analyze for is the ratio of the different types of oxygen that are in the ancient atmosphere, or indeed the modern atmosphere.
In the ice itself, in fact.
And in the ice itself. So you can do that on the ice or on the gas that you release from the ice. And oxygen has three different forms with three different atomic weights. And the two common ones are oxygen 18, which is heavy, and oxygen 16, which is lighter. And the ratio between those two, they're called isotopes of the element, it changes as the temperature changes. So if you measure, according to a known, established, empirical, that's factual, based on observation and experiment, relationship. So if you can measure the ratio between oxygen 18 and oxygen 16 in an ancient sample, then you can directly turn that into an estimated, it's not a measured temperature, but it's an estimated paleo temperature. And it's a tried and tested technique, very widely used and understood, and it's not absolutely accurate in the sense that a thermometer measurement is absolutely accurate, but it has a great deal of scientific credibility.
Now, Bob Carter, I want to explore another idea that follows from our discussion up to now, and it's as follows. The CO2 right now is increasing. Is it possible that the CO2 increase that we can measure, and it's clear, is actually due to a global warming that could be occurring? And because, you see, the CO2 that we put into the atmosphere from industrial activity is a small amount compared to all of the other places where you can put active, reactive CO2 in the planet. For example, dissolved in the ocean's water. That's, 100 times more than everything that's in the atmosphere, and so on. There are these very different compartments where you have reactive CO2, including in plant material that dies and decays, and that releases CO2, and so on and so on. Is it possible that our industrial activity is small compared to all of these other possible influxes and outfluxes of CO2 in the planet, and that really we're getting a net small increase, small compared to these large compartments that I'm talking about, because something is driving a temperature increase? Could be the sun, could be something else. Is that a plausible idea?
It's not just plausible or possible, it's highly likely. Let me back up to the question we left hanging from the ice cores, which is, I said that because you're right that the change in temperature precedes the change in carbon dioxide, then we know that, how's that happening? Well, what's happening? What is the change in temperature doing that is causing a change in carbon dioxide? And the answer to that is it's very well known that carbon dioxide is more soluble in colder water. And many of your listeners will daily perform an experiment on this very principle when they come home from work after a hard day, and depending upon their preferences, they will either take the top off a bottle of beer or a bottle of sparkling wine. And in both cases, the top comes off the bottle and the bubbles of carbon dioxide start coming out initially because you've released the pressure. But as you set your glass of beer or wine on the table and chat to your friends, the bubbles keep on exsolving out of that fluid, and that's because it's warming up. So as you warm a body of water or fluid that has carbon dioxide dissolved in it, which your beer and your sparkling wine does, then you drive the bubbles of carbon dioxide out. They dissolve into the atmosphere as the warming occurs. The oceans are basically just a big bath filled with champagne, if you like, full of dissolved carbon dioxide. So as you warm the oceans, which you do as you go from a glaciation into an interglaciation, there's a change in global temperature of around 6 degrees when you do that, 5 or 6 degrees. As that warming occurs, that drives the gas that's dissolved in the ocean back up into the atmosphere.
And yes, I was going to stress to our listeners that the amount of gas that can be produced that way is much greater than everything that's been produced from industrial activity since we've been burning coal.
Hugely greater.
Yeah.
And there's no doubt about the reality of this mechanism. That said, the people who remain alarmed about the carbon dioxide issue will use arguments based upon isotope analysis, the same oxygen isotope analysis, similar that I spoke of before. And they're very complicated arguments, but they argue that the isotope evidence, because the ratio in the atmosphere of carbon, actually not oxygen, the ratio of the carbon isotopes is changing over the last 150 years, and it is asserted that it's changing in the direction that is consistent with the amount of fossil fuels that we are burning, because fossil fuels have a characteristic isotope signature, carbon isotope signature. Now, that's a very valid scientific argument, and many expert scientists think that that is a constraining argument on the whole debate. As a geologist, I acknowledge the power of those physical arguments, but I also look at the matter from the global point of view, warming up the oceans and knowing what will happen. And so I'm not completely convinced, and nor are other scientists, that the isotope arguments are completely watertight. But they are certainly a strong argument for human emissions having an impact on the global atmosphere. But,
so how does the argument go again? The isotopic ratios of the carbon in the CO2 that's presently in the atmosphere?
Yes, is changing. It's becoming less negative year by year by year. And if you calculate the ratio of the carbon isotopes in fossil fuels, coal or petroleum or gas, is very, very negative, so, and much more so than the average atmosphere.
Right.
So as you burn those fuels and put that very negative carbon into the atmosphere, it drives a decline in the global carbon ratio.
Right, right.
And the carbon isotope ratio, and they therefore say, well, that's about right. We've done the numbers, and this is the amount of fossil fuel we burned, and this is how much it should have changed that isotope ratio, and we measured the isotope ratio, and gee whiz, look, that's right. So it is the case that very, very few scientists will deny that burning fossil fuels is not adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. It is, and it is having some effect on the isotope ratio of the atmosphere. But the question is, the big unanswered question is, what about the huge natural sinks and sources, which you've mentioned, in dissolved carbon dioxide in the ocean, the carbon dioxide already in the atmosphere, and then the biosphere, and the fact we exchange carbon across all those reservoirs through the process of plant photosynthesis and physicochemical changes. So it really is a very complex situation, which is why I like to come back to the simple elements and you introduced into the conversation one of the key, I think, framework arguments, which is, hang on, we look at the ice cores and we see that the change in temperature occurs before the change in carbon dioxide. Well, that being the case, and it is the case, then, chaps, I'm interested in your sophisticated isotope arguments, but you need to go back and have another look at them, because they don't quite seem to be right.
Right. There's a challenge there, at the very least.
There's a challenge.
Yes. Now,
as in so many things, the science is unsettled. And if there's one thing that drives me demented, it's this constant parroting by, it has to be said, green environmental groups mainly, that the science is settled. That is just so completely untrue of any science debate, let alone this one, that it's a political ploy, isn't it, basically?
Yeah, okay, we'll come back to that question of the science being settled or not, but before we take our mid-show music break, I want to ask you a few questions about yourself and your career. I'm having this discussion with Dr. Bob Carter, who's sitting in Australia at the moment. Now, it says here in your bio that you are currently Chief Science Advisor to the International Climate Science Coalition. Could you tell us what that is?
Yeah, that's a group actually based, headquartered in Ottawa, so it's not far away from here. The executive director is a gentleman called Tom Harris, and it's one of a number of climate science coalitions around the world which have a similar objective. The first one was actually started in New Zealand, and there are also branches in Australia, US, and there's the international one. There isn't one specifically in Canada, I guess, because the international group is headquartered there. So what does this group do? It's made up of independent scientists, engineers, economists, and other professional people who have been alarmed by the amount of propaganda as opposed to good, balanced advice, scientific advice, that dominates the public debate on this issue. So the Climate Science Coalition is committed to providing both sides of the argument. It does not have a strong position and say that humans can't have an effect on climate or can't cause warming. Of course they can. It's not about the potential, it's about the actuality. The question is how much climate change is driven by humans. As we've teased out in the last 20 minutes or so, many of the arguments are very complex, and it is completely misleading to imply that the science is settled and it's a done deal. Now, a really important point here, it's most unfortunate that the argument between the United Nations scientists, the IPCC, who we can call the alarmists, people who are alarmed about the potential of human-caused climate change, the argument between them and people like me who would say they are agnostics about the issue and independent scientists has been polarized in political ways by political groups. So it is often said that extreme right-wing people are the denialists and the independent scientists. They're all extremely right-wing. And the United Nations is full of left-wing socialist loonies. Now, that is just not the case. And one of the things that the International Climate Science Coalition and its brother coalitions are insistent about is that they take no political stance. There are scientists of all political opinions on both sides of the debate. And the main aim of the International Climate Science Coalition is to ensure that both sides of that debate are heard.
Mm-hmm. Now, in this description of you, it also says that you're an emeritus fellow of the Institute of Public Affairs. What is that?
That's a libertarian think tank, and it's based in Melbourne, Australia. It was founded in the 1940s, and interestingly, I think it's the oldest libertarian think tank in the world. An equivalent in Canada would probably be the Fraser organization. And it is committed to a libertarian approach to matters of public policy, and that includes science, the use of basic independent science. One of the problems, which I'm sure you're aware of, and it must be true in Canada as it is in Australia, is that because of the strong funding requirements that a scientific agency has, I'm talking about a government agency now. And the fact that, although it's also true of university agencies, but they're, in a sense, quasi-governmental. In order to do modern science, you need the sort of money that can only be provided by governments. And because of that, it is very rare now for a national science organisation, no matter how prestigious, and for example, I would include the Royal Society of London in this criticism, because the Royal Society of London now gives policy advice to the British government, and in return for that, it is paid money. And instantly, you've lost your independence. So one of the problems the public have today, and they do not perceive this, is that we have lost most, if not all, of the traditional institutions we can go to ask for a disinterested opinion, a non-political opinion on even a scientific matter. There is a huge loss of independence across the world in government agencies that are dealing with science, and especially when they're dealing with climate science.
Okay, well, that's a good introduction to your background, and we're going to take just a short music break, and we'll be right back with some more in-depth discussion. I'm in discussion with Dr. Bob Carter, and we'll be back after this song, which is called, well, it's Artie White, and the song is called The More You Lie to Me. And so in about 3 minutes, we'll be right back. You've got time to run to get a glass of water or whatever you need to do, and we'll be back after this.
No, you ain't. You just get me crazy about you, baby. Finna tell me another one? You say that we should be together each and every day. Tell me another lie. You just won't tell me the truth. Oh no. Look like the more you lie to me, crazy I get about you. You told me last night how much you love me so, but tonight you're telling me I got to hit the door. Tell me another lie. You just won't tell me the truth. I don't know why. Look like the more you lie to me, crazy I get about you. For a while, but I'll talk to your mother. She said you're the only child. Tell me another lie.
It's a big, bad world out there. Global commerce has brought us goods from the four corners of the earth.
But sometimes it sucks.
Support Local Month is all about Ottawa's cafes, artists, breweries, musicians, shops, and restaurants.
Join Apartment 613 and 70 of our closest friends.
And hopefully their friends.
For Support Local Month all month long during November. For more details, head to www.apt613.ca.
Ever since I found out about CHUO, I've been listening to the radio all day long just to catch my favorite shows. Didn't matter what else I had to do, whether I was eating breakfast, in the car, at work, or at a party. Things were just getting out of hand. Now that CHUO has launched their new on-demand service, I can catch up with up to 4 weeks of my favorite shows anytime that's convenient for me. I just go to chuo.fm and click on the on-air guide for my favorite show. How cool is that?
Hey, we're back. This is the 5 o'clock train. We're on every single Thursday of the year from 5 to 6 p.m. with an in-depth interview with some guest out there. It could be about politics, science, social change. It could be all kinds of things. This time it's about climate change. We're in discussion with Dr. Bob Carter, who's sitting at home way over in Australia, in Queensland, in fact. Welcome back, Bob.
Hello again, Dennis.
Yeah. So, you know, the way you've been describing how the public debate is going, I note that there are not a lot of scientists trying to make the point that you're making, which is that the debate, the scientific debate, is not balanced. That it's almost like they want to go along for some reason. I mean, you're really making a criticism of professional ethics to some degree, are you not?
Oh, I guess I am. But I'm uncomfortable in doing so, not least because I've retired as a scientist now, but of course until recently I was collecting research grants from the Australian funding agency as any other senior scientist would have been. And so I'm well aware of the pressures on scientists in the system. I spoke just before the break about government institutions having now basically lost their independence of thought. They have to, any releases they make, irrespective of the scientific matter, have to be carefully done so they don't conflict with the policy of the government of the day. Now that's also become truer and truer of scientists you'd like to think are completely independent working in universities. For example, back in the 1990s, something that seems entirely reasonable to a businessman or a politician was introduced into the research funding scene in Australia, and that is when you filled in the form each year to apply, or every 3 years, because that's how long the grants go, so every 3 years you apply for a new one, you fill in the form, and they introduced a new box on the form where in 100 words you were required to say what was the value to Australia of the scientific research you were proposing to do. Now, there's only one appropriate answer to that question, and it doesn't need 100 words. It needs one word or two, which is scientific research. It is its own justification. Knowledge is its own justification. But in the modern world, of course, you couldn't get away with that for a millisecond. You'd be derided, and your application wouldn't even be considered. So scientists are forced to make up, and being creative people, they're very good at doing this, 100-word statements that explain how important for the national economy or national well-being in some way or another their research is. You may think that that's a storm in the teacup, and why am I making this point? It's because it's the first step on a very long, slippery slope.
Well, just the term scientific research, those two words, if you put them in the box, they imply that the science is true science. In other words, that it's honest science, that the scientist
Correct.
is being completely unaligned and truly honest, looking for the truth, basically. It
Correct.
assumes all of that, which is often absent, and in fact, when they encourage you to say more than that, they're encouraging you to lie in a particular direction.
They are, or they're encouraging your proclivities to do work which might be viewed as developmental or engineering work, not science research in the traditional sense. Now, I don't say that in a pejorative way. I have the greatest admiration for clever engineering and development of ideas and products and processes and so on is very important in society. But that needs to be a separate chunk of money. It is not a good idea to go to your creative scientific community who are driven, indeed as all creative artists are, by a desire to understand the world better. That's what drives a scientist. They are fascinated by the way things work in the natural system.
Well, but Bob, I'm going to interrupt you for just a minute because I'm going to challenge what you just said. I would say that what drives most scientists working in governments and universities and so on is careerism.
Now, but that's not traditionally the case. I absolutely agree with you, but most people back in the 1950s and 60s when I got into this game, you were driven by your intense curiosity about the way the world, well, in my case, it's an astonishing trivial thing, from some perspectives. I was intrigued by why do bivalved shellfish, fossil bivalve shellfish, ancient scallops and mussels and so on, why do they have radial ribs? What's the function of those radial ribs? And almost unbelievable by today's standards, I was funded to do a PhD to investigate that for 3 years. And what I learned was how to think. Okay? I didn't discover penicillin. I didn't make some brand new technological gizmo, but I learned how to think. And I've since gone on and worked through my career sometimes on practical matters. But this is called blue skies research, and it's really, really important. And the difficulty is that the money that used to be spent on blue skies research has increasingly been diverted into government-approved research. And in Australia, we now have nominated national science priorities, and you are more likely to be funded if you apply for money in one of those 4 priority areas. Well, that presumes that somebody's clever enough to know in advance what discovery needs to be made. And of course, all the great discoveries are serendipitous. Nobody knows in advance they're going to make them.
But I would also argue that if, as a young developing scientist, you're allowed and given the resources to do that so-called blue sky research, that the project belongs to you, therefore you develop from your sense of self and who you are and what you want to do, and then you, as a result, learn how to think, as you say, but also that implies that you're learning how to think independently so that later in your career you can do what you're doing now, which is to be critical of what has happened, right?
I think you've put your finger on arguably the single most important point. You learn to be fiercely independent intellectually. Because it can easily be misrepresented, let me just tease out slightly what I've said, if I may, and it's this. You might say, well, the taxpayer can't afford to pay these guys to follow their hobby in a university. The taxpayer money needs to be spent, this is what the businessman will say, on practical matters. Now, there's a very good analogy in business that businessmen understand, which is advertising. Any senior executive in a large commercial organization understands that the number from various studies is around 80% of the money spent on advertising is wasted, in the sense it doesn't result in any increase in sales or any other benefit. So if you knew in advance which 20% of your advertising was going to be effective, any major corporation could save up to 80% of their advertising budget. But of course they don't and they can't, because nobody is clever enough to know in advance which bits of advertising are actually going to work. So just like investing on the stock market, they diversify the risk by trying different things across the advertising spectrum. They never put all their money in one piggy bank. Scientific research is exactly the same. If you fund 100 scientists, give them $1 million each to go away and do their hobby, whatever interests them. Some will be counting the number of scales on the butterfly's back. Others will be measuring the pH of the local swamp. Others will be doing experiments measuring starlight or solar radiation or whatever. But see, you give 100 scientists that amount of money for 3 years, send them away. At the end of that time, you will have 1 or 2 useful, in the sense that we can turn these into money, we can make a gizmo or charge somebody for a service. You'll have 1 or 2 useful results.
But I want to add something.
Nobody knows in advance which 1 or 2.
Yeah, your point is well understood. This idea of sort of the competitive approach, in a sense, or the evolutionary approach to development of ideas. But I want to say this. If you're out there counting the scales on a butterfly's wings, whatever research you're doing, I don't care what it is. In my experience, I've changed fields of research many, many times. You'll always, if you're an honest scientist, you'll always find that the people in your own research area are often hiding things, going along with things, not being scrupulously honest, but preferring to be careerist. And so you've got an occasion to challenge the status quo. And what I find these days, scientists are not doing that. Well, so I would let scientists do what they want, provided that when they come across something that needs to be said, that they actually say it.
Yeah, that's a tricky one, because they have wives and mortgages and children to support just like anybody else does. So there's a point at which a scientist has to earn a crust. And because of the various things we've been talking about, increasingly these days that's going to mean a government grant of some sort or another. Either they're going to work for a government science organisation directly, or they're going to be in a university or research institution which will be receiving government research grants. So there is, I completely agree with what you're saying, except to some extent I will defend the scientists because they have nowhere else to go. They either do the job the government is offering money to be done, which is to do science which supports current government policy. They either do that or they don't have a job. And in the climate change area, it's become quite sinister. The level of intimidation on particularly young and mid-career researchers on this is horrifying. And many scientists have lost research funding or their job for speaking up independently. Now, it's very easy, what do I mean by that? By giving an opinion in public which says, hang on a moment, global warming isn't quite all it's cracked up to be. There are two sides to this story. No young scientist can say that in public and survive as a career scientist today. That is a true pathology of the current situation, and it's disgraceful.
Yes. I want to come back to this last point that you just made. We're going to come right back to it, but we have to take a very short commercial break. We were talking about surviving and needing to earn your way, so we're going to take this very short break, and we'll be right back.
Long-distance phone cards are a thing of the past. TPI Pinless is changing the way you access cheap long-distance worldwide. TPI Pinless serves over 120 countries with incredibly low long-distance charges. Go to your usual African, Caribbean, Asian, Middle Eastern, or Latino outlet and ask for TPI Pinless. With TPI Pinless, you can load your phone here or top up your friend or family cell phone in any of the countries listed. As we know, in some places, phone credit can be used as currency. This is an invaluable gift for your friends and loved ones. Call 613-791-2717 for information about finding an outlet or becoming one. That's 613-791-2717.
This is it. You're planning your next big night out. Want to go out dancing? Want to see a great live music show? Do you want to meet up with friends, have a drink, and share in a little piece of local history? Believe it or not, there's a great venue where you can do all these things, and it's right on your front doorstep. Le Petit Chicago at 50 Promenade du Portage has it all. Best way to find out about Latin Night, live music, and all the other great events that go down in this classic meeting place, petitchicago.ca. Come, check out the monthly calendar at petitchicago.ca. Petit Chicago has something for the music lover in everyone.
Okay, we're back with Dr. Bob Carter, and this is the very final segment of our 1 hour in-depth interview. You're listening to the 5 o'clock train. We're on every single Thursday of the year from 5 to 6 p.m. I'm your host, Denis Rancourt, and Dr. Carter. Well, we're really touching at the heart of scientific behavior in our society right now. But you are... Sorry about that. My microphone just died, so I had to change mic in the middle of my sentence. Are you still there, Bob?
Yes, I'm still there.
Okay, well, at least your technical side is working. But, yes, I mean, you have been an expert witness on climate change for the U.S. Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, and you've done that kind of work for the Australian, New Zealand parliamentary committees and so on. You've had to be honest. You've had to be direct. Was this at a later stage in your career where you were able to do that kind of work?
Yes, if you were to ask me for a list of 100 scientists of merit who take the independent view on climate change and global warming, that is to say, they say, yeah, carbon dioxide is greenhouse gas. Yeah, good question to ask. If we're putting industrial amounts in the atmosphere, we might be causing climate change. We should look at that. All sensible scientists would agree with that. But then the point comes where the United Nations says, holy cow, this is a big problem, we've got to do something about it, revolutionise the world's energy economy. Those independent scientists would say, no, hang on a moment, it's not as simple as that, and we don't think the evidence is there to do that. I could give you a list of 100 scientists. Now, you tell me the age demographic of that list of 100.
Old. Am I right?
I missed that.
I said old. Experience, let's put it that way.
I was listening for a percentage and I didn't hear it. The answer is over 90% of them would be retired.
Oh, yeah.
And there's a very good reason for that, because, and I'm in that category. So, yes, indeed, it was probably coincidental more than driven by my lack of moral fibre when I was younger. But it certainly is the case. I started to speak out publicly on this issue about the same time as I retired. And it's overwhelmingly the case that the senior science citizens who are now retired are the people who largely populate the ranks of the skeptics. And that's because, as I said just before the ad break, young scientists today have nowhere to go. They have absolutely no choice. They either toe the line, follow the propaganda line, or they won't have a job. Now, in saying that, I want to stress, I not only don't blame those young scientists, I am intensely sorry for them. I think it's an absolute scandal that the scientific system has been degraded to the point where young scientists are basically required to toe a political line.
Yeah, I don't know to what degree they're required, strictly required, to the degree that you see out there, but that's another debate on its own. But I want to, in our final minutes, I want to suggest the following. This is the way, the system is driving us towards accepting this idea of global warming. I would propose to you because a lot of powerful people want a carbon economy, and the reason they want a carbon economy is because there are trillions to be made with this new economy. The large financiers are going to benefit. The large global financiers are going to reap incredible amounts of money from this. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, I would, and again, I guess this is something that one is more prepared to take a punt on after one's retired. I'm acutely uncomfortable that as a scientist I'm sitting here answering questions about politics. I will answer it nonetheless, but let me just say that that's not the genre I normally work in. I wrote a little book on this issue a couple of years ago called Climate, the Counter-Consensus. And in writing that book I discovered, which set out just to be an account of the science of global warming. Now, in writing that book, I discovered that you can't do that. There is no possible way, because the book was intended for the general public.
Yes.
And there's no way you can address this issue without dealing with the political side of it. So I think the book has 13 chapters, and the first 5 chapters are science, as simple as I can make it for a general reader. But then the bulk of the book, the rest of the book, 7 chapters or so, discusses political issues like the one we've just talked about on young scientists and science funding, and like the one you've now raised. Remind me what the question was.
Well, my point is, I don't think it's an accident that there's this amount of mental streamlining of the scientific community. I don't think it's an accident. There are powerful forces at play here.
Absolutely, and I have a chapter in the book, Climate, the Counter-Consensus, that addresses that. And it's even worse than, in a sense, you summarised, because it's not just there are powerful forces at play, it is that every single major powerful political force or social force in our society has found ways or perceives ways in which they can benefit from the climate alarmism, and specifically from taxing carbon dioxide or having a cap-and-trade system. In that sense, I have to say your Prime Minister Harper and Canada are world leaders at the moment, and I just wish you'd actually shout about it a bit more in having left Kyoto and said you're going to have nothing to do with this nonsense anymore. As you know, I live in Australia, and unfortunately Australia is still stringing along with the nonsense. So all the major groups in society, for example, I mentioned scientific societies earlier, they get money from the government to give opinions or stimulate research that suits the government ends on this. The churches, you may say, well, what about them? Well, the churches of all denominations for many years have been desperate for lack of membership. And one of the ways of getting people back through the door is to get them concerned, a social conscience, on issues like this. So you'll find that most of the churches have seized this issue as one from which they'll benefit. Obviously, the green organisations are making money out of it.
And it's easy. It's easy for any fossil fuel corporation to go green. They just have to say that they're green. They just have to.
Well, and most of them are actually funding Greenpeace and the World Wildlife Fund, like agencies, to keep them off their back. But then possibly the most pernicious of all is the business community. And that's for two reasons. Firstly, there's the rent seekers of industries like windmills and solar power. And you can say, well, they're just doing what businessmen do. And if the government's stupid enough to subsidise them with taxpayers' money, good on them. They're just being good businessmen. And in a sense, fine, but that's actually what's going on.
You've got 20 seconds.
But the bigger part of the community is the financial part of the community, the banks,
Yes.
the big accountancy firms, and the stock market people. They think clipping carbon dioxide tickets is the way to trillions of dollars in the future.
Yes.
And they're right, and they're the strongest single force behind this.
Yes, I think that's a perfect point to end on. Thank you very much for being with us, Bob Carter. Thank you very much for that.
Dennis, thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
It was a great pleasure. Thanks a lot. We'll be back next week, and we'll just have this transition song for you. This is 3 o'clock in the